I wanted to welcome people from all around the world to the Innovation Theater today. Today, ATX and Cox are going to be talking about navigating the journey to DOCSIS 4.0. I'm joined here today by T. Harton, who's the Senior Director of OSP Engineering at Cox, and Jay Lee, who's the CTO at ATX Networks, and I'm Dan Whalen, the CEO and President of ATX Networks. Well, gentlemen, great to be here together with you live in person. And great to see that you have your pants on and we're not in a typical COVID work from home gear that we wear. T, special thanks to you and Cox for joining us today. That's great.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So we'll start you off with a simple question. We have a complicated subject to get to today. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. I started in the cable industry straight out of college, went to work for a small little cable company, manufacturer, Scientific Atlanta. Went to Antec, a few names that we know and love, but was mostly on the vendor side until I moved to Cox in 2009. So I've been with Cox since then. Love it on both sides, and but I've been involved in outside plant equipment essentially my entire career. So a good space to be in, and worked well. I got to stay at home, right?
Yeah, that's great.
What's your team tasked with or mandated?
Our team is focused on the architecture, upfront engineering, and post-deployment support for our Hfc network and equipment, our fiber to the home network and equipment, and our fog, other stuff. So anything, and we're part of the outside plant engineering and construction group. So our primary focus is upfront engineering and architecture so that we can then build a network, but making sure that these networks are supportable and reliable for our eventual customers.
That's awesome. We're always so envious. Cox always leads in getting out with some of the new technologies. But as it pertains to Cox's network, what's the underlying access architecture today?
Our vast majority is still HFC, right? We pass more than 11 million homes with HFC. Most of our greenfield builds are now fiber to the home, and so we're north of 700,000. You'll see more fiber move into the mix for us, but still robust HFC plans, as well as growing our fiber.
On your HFC side of the network, if you were to hazard a guess in terms of classifying it N+4, N+6, N+0, how would you break that up?
We started with N+0 with Remote PHY, and then we branched out with Remote PHY into the N+X world. Okay. And so we continue to grow our RPD footprint and our N0 footprint as well.
And so from an N+0 standpoint, I think originally a few years back it was going to be a more aggressive build towards N+0. I think you guys, like lots of MSOs, were targeting N+0 and overlaying FDX on that architecture as sort of the next big move forward in terms of increasing upstream capacity.
Right. You
pulled back a little bit. I think things changed a little bit from that front. Now the focus is more on DOCSIS 4.0 extended spectrum. Is that fair to say?
Well, I wouldn't say we pulled back from it. I would say that we got better at targeting N0 capacity to the application, okay. Right? And so we're still doing N0 in places where it makes sense, where we've got high concentration of users, a lot of demand on the services we're trying to deliver, and we know that those service groups need to be really small. That's not necessary everywhere, at least not initially, and so growing with a mid-split or an N+X strategy works in some areas and is more cost-effective than going N0 for the whole footprint. But there are places where it's still the best solution. N0 is certainly the right way to go.
Right. And sorry. Go ahead.
And you mentioned mid-split and possibly high split. So what are you thinking there? Why would you choose mid-split or high split? And what are the drivers for you in that?
Well, we started mid-split long before COVID. So we started looking at mid-split in late 2017, I guess. started some trials in 2018. And so we're a couple, 3 years into rolling mid-split out across the footprint. And so mid-split has been going well. Easier for us to operationalize mid-split because it's more of the same of what we're used to doing on the HFC side. So it rolls out well. It gets you a good amount of capacity. It also targets the area where we're constrained, which has been upstream, primarily during COVID. It targets the amount of, it targets the area which is creating the pain and adds that capacity.
You mentioned the ease of operation with mid-split. So what about high split? Is this thing really going to happen at any point?
We're about to find out. We're going to do some trials for high split. High split, simply because of the frequencies of operation, brings some new challenges, out of band, CLI, things that you have to solve. We also eased our way into mid-split by preparing ourselves CPE-wise years before we started doing it. So we had a good base of CPE that was mid-split capable. We need to get in that place and are getting into that place for high split as well. It's a process, right? It's a process to line up the hurdles, knock them down, and then move forward. And so you'll see us starting to dip our toes in the water here in a bigger way starting next year.
You mentioned the product being ready to help you make that transition. Are there other big items out there in terms of DOCSIS 4.0 readiness for Cox to think about?
We got to get silicon, then we got to get silicon integrated into products, and then we got to get those products deployed and operational and then supportable. So we got a long still way to go, but it's a relatively straightforward kind of chain of events that we've been through many times.
We're going to dive into the products specifically a little further, but you've got product readiness or the technical aspects of things, and you've got the commercial. What do you think is the long pole in the tent in terms of seeing DOCSIS 4.0 roll out in the network?
The product readiness. I think for us, we kind of accept the fact that capacity we're going to need. We know we're going to need it. And so having the hardware to actually do that and pivot from what we're doing today to potentially a more R&B focused DOCSIS 4.0 world is attractive. We look at models all the time about how far are we going to go? We're going to go all the way to 1.8. What does it look like beyond 1.8? What does 1.2 buy you? And so we're looking at those options, but I think we're pretty well bought into the fact that with 4.0, and we've got guys on the spec committees working on the amplifier specs too. So we're pretty bought into the fact that 4.0 with a drop-in upgrade and some booster amps is going to get us where we need to on HFC for a good long time.
So it's extended spectrum 4.0 that Cox is focused on,
yeah,
versus FDX or even going fiber to the home. It's just
fiber to the home will actually probably expand how much fiber to the home we do. Beyond Greenfield, we'll start doing some brownfield. But you got an awful lot of network there that it takes time to bring it along, but there's a clear technical path on how you bring it along to get to the service level you want.
Yeah, and so clearly a lot of people smarter than me have been putting a lot of thought in this. Cable Labs validated, that HFC was going to be, an HFC transition to DOCSIS 4.0 was really going to be the economical way. Have you guys done stuff to validate whether or not that holds true or not?
We're still a little early in that. I mean, we've got some models with some big assumptions in them, like how much is ATX going to charge me extra for that? But I mean, but generally, yeah, we have some big fluffy models where the numbers look attractive. When we get closer to what we're going to actually be dealing with, we'll be able to refine those. But it's still HFC investments are still pretty attractive financially.
And it seems like there's been, like we're in a unique situation with respect to the collaboration that's going on within the industry, at least from where I sit. Mm-hmm. You've got the component enablers, you've got the MSO, you've got vendors like an ATX and everybody's throwing their hat in the ring to really
Right.
figure this out, and it's looking quite promising. That's for sure.
I'm impressed too. It's been good collaboration, and a lot of work has gone into making sure that when we get there, we're all happy with where we got.
And a lot of the thought is economically around drop-ins, right? And
Yeah.
you're gonna lean on a lot of the traditional players in the space to help with that. Are there any big hairy ones that are, that you're worried about? The 1.8 drop-ins for nodes. Is it something else in the HFC architecture that has you worried?
Not really worried. I think 1.8 and the ability to maybe go to 3 beyond that, 3 gig beyond that, makes drop in a little harder. But if I can save the spot, the location, I got a pedestal there, I've already built structure to be able to reuse that, regardless of whether I have to change, the housing out. That's still attractive. That's still better than a complete redo with new spacings and new structure. So it looks like, at least from the initial work that's being done on the amplifier specs, that's going to be possible. We're not looking at forget what it's called, that distributed gain architecture, which is, 25 or 30 small little amplifiers. We're looking more along the traditional route of, a drop-in amplifier upgrade with some booster amps where necessary, to achieve 1.8 at DOCSIS 4.0.
So the 4.0 product portfolio from an HFC perspective is 4.0 node, 1.8 gigahertz amplifier portfolio, which is like line extenders, multi-port amplifiers, and
Right.
booster amps.
Right.
1.8 gigahertz plus taps.
Yep.
And then CP, right?
Right.
What's your if you were to hazard a guess on this in terms of timing, what do you see?
I think we'll see the passives first, right? You guys have a version. We've been inquiring around the industry about where are we. So I think we'll see the passives available pretty soon, if not already. The actives are going to be, there's still some work going on around the actives, and so those will probably happen before the R&D for DOCSIS 4.0 is ready, but close. Timing wise, those will be relatively close, and then before we know it, in the next year or two, we're going to be sitting looking at a complete suite of hardware that we could go and do a deployment.
Well, keying back in on the product readiness and how that affects your move to DOCSIS 4.0. We've been out talking about our 2 gig taps with the industry, and I think we put a pretty compelling case together around the cost savings of not having to go retouch taps later on in the future to upgrade to DOCSIS 4.0. At least one major MSO has agreed with us that it's the right time, if the technology's ready, go out and do it and save on the construction costs in the future of having to revisit. How do you feel about it? Is that something that you think about today?
Yeah, no, I think that there's clearly some benefits there that we'll explore and look at, because obviously every cap that you replace today because you had to is one you don't replace tomorrow because you want to. So that's a good place to be, but there's also, an impact, right? It's a lot harder a lot harder, but it is more difficult to splice in a tap than change a faceplate. And we do quite a few faceplate changes due to maintenance issues. So, but it's certainly something worth looking at, and the economics, if you can overcome the hurdles of accepting that extra burden for a repair job, the economics look attractive.
Our analysis was run at a sort of a failure rate of in and around 1%. And every time you rolled a truck, whether it was to fix a loose screw, do a faceplate swap, or swap an entire device, we sort of ran the model. Let's swap the entire device every time for a 1.8, and alternatively, let's fix it as cost effectively as possible. And we timelined it around a 5-year time horizon to get to DOCSIS 4.0, and there was savings. It wasn't massive, but it certainly wasn't costing you money to take the sort of evolution mode, if you will, and start to phase it in. So,
Yeah, it's an area that we're starting to look at.
right.
Certainly that analysis from ATX helps.
Right.
Yeah, it's an opportunity for sure.
What about on the amplifier side of things? Like, certainly from our perspective, the amplifiers that are being conceptualized today in the SCTE working group all contemplate diplex filters, and that really starts to make somebody like Cox put their thinking cap on in terms of, when do I put a 1.8 gigahertz amplifier in place? Like, the forward path is easy; it's 1.8 gigahertz, but
Right.
what return split are you gonna put in there? Do you think it's at a high split 1.8 gigahertz? That's step one, or?
I think currently, and our planning group is looking into those different options. Currently, I think we're kind of landing on 396 as kind of the sweet spot for us when we get to the amount of upstream bandwidth we want to provide in that 1.8 plant. That's our current thinking. Obviously, it could go higher or lower, but 396 I think is where we're kind of.
Yeah, and let's talk about the other sexy part of the equation with cable, power. And as you start thinking about the move to 1.8 gigahertz amplifiers in your network, there's a lot of things that will obviously go along with that increased RF amplification. You're going to need to have a better power solution out in the field. We sort of run some models that contemplate maybe a 40 to 60% power increase around the 1.8 amplifiers. How do you feel about that?
That's too much. Way too much.
Yeah.
I mean, 40 to 60% reduction, now
Yeah.
you're talking, right? But I mean, and we'll have to keep an eye on it, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of the secret sauce that folks are working on in the AMP working group and with R&Ds and all of that stuff, is that we all recognize that power in the plant is costly. We don't want to have to upgrade it if we don't have to, but there are going to be times and technologies that are going to drive that. But the smallest increment possible is obviously desirable, because setting new power supplies, permitting them, it's just a challenge. When you're trying to do an upgrade and you're trying to maintain a pace of operations, it's hard to stop and wait for permits or permission, honestly, to set new power supplies.
So I think, as a few years ago, we packaged Jay up in a car and sent him off into the future to the year 2050 to start his 2050 project. And come back with some of the findings and talked with operators about it. One of the key questions that we were asking about is the longevity of the Hfc network, and we're big believers, and it's obviously all of our investments in cable are going into the extension and evolution of HFC and supporting better speeds, more economical, affordable broadband for people. If 20 years is the right number for HFC, the longevity of it, do you see it going 20 years or longer? The majority of cable operators seem to believe that it would be. How do you feel about it?
I think at least 20, right? I mean, it's hard to argue with an installed network, right? At the end of the day, it's hard to argue with something that's already there, already delivering services, with a technical path to continue to meet the demands of the customer base hanging off of that network. It's awful hard to argue against that. Yes, there are other options. There are better options in some instances if you need capacity beyond what HFC is going to be able to deliver. But at the end of the day, that installed network continues to pay dividends.
And you've been around the industry long enough. It seems like yesterday we were talking about whether 550 would be enough for the industry and whether you'd never need to go beyond there. So it's really exciting. Been a real special treat having you here with us today to go through this. I feel educated. I wish I had my notebook.
Well, I don't think I educated you that much. But thanks for having me. I think it's an exciting time for the industry as we transition to, DOCSIS 4.0. There are some exciting capabilities that are going to come to a node near you pretty soon, which is good to see.
So from ATX and Cox, thank you for joining us today in our Navigating the Journey to DOCSIS 4.0. As a reminder, we'll be taking live questions at the end of this session, so we look forward to hearing from you.